All right. So one of the cool things about being an electronic musician is that I think we frequently find ourselves in situations with limitations. So if we're using a step sequencer, well, the main limitation here is length. It's not easy to put in long melodies or place them across several sequences. And especially if you're using a modular system, for example, you are stuck with a short sequence. So what do you do to make the track consisting of short sequences interesting? And obviously there are many approaches, taking this as a given and then applying various DSP effects and so on. But today I want to present a technique of my own that I haven't seen anywhere else. So maybe it's an innovative technique, and maybe you folks will find it useful for your music as well. But before talking about it, why not listen to it? So, in the description of this video, you'll find a link to a track called Particle Flow. This track profusely uses this technique. So go ahead, pause the video, listen to it, and then come back. And I actually have almost a guarantee that you're coming back and saying, okay, so, I listened to it. I didn't hear anything special. And yes, you probably did not, but your brain did. And the track probably felt much fresher, much more interesting, with more movement than it would have otherwise. So let me talk to you about what this technique is, and I'm going to switch to slides. I actually prepared slides for this slideshow. Okay, so here's the technique. Imagine you have a couple of patterns, and it could be something like, a bass line, percussion, or a bass line in a sequence, or two sequences, whatever. And you want to introduce a little bit of movement, because as you're, listening to this, like, sure, it's fine, you can make these sequences interesting, but how can you make them more interesting? So let's say you move the second half of these copies, pattern copies aside, and then you shift them by a step, right? And then you, of course, wrap it around so that there are no gaps. And that's the technique. So here's what it does. There are two effects happening here. So the first effect is that this movement is registered by your ears, by your brain, but if you're applying this technique correctly, it's not going to register consciously. And so you're going to feel like something has changed, but I have no idea what. And then there's another very important benefit, and that is whenever you have two things playing at the same time, you're going to have frequencies of these different instruments or samples or whatever mask each other. You're going to have notes that play together mask each other a little bit in ways that you might not even be aware of. And when you move these things slightly, suddenly you're going to hear things that you didn't hear before. And it will register as an interesting and welcome change. So for example, when you were listening to Particle Flow, I'm pretty sure that at some point suddenly you would hear the bass line better. And frequently we have this effect when we're listening to a track that has a lot of complicated things going on. We're gonna, from time to time, we'll have like our attention is gonna jump from one instrument to another. Like, oh, now I'm listening to the bass line. Oh, now I'm noticing hi-hats. But in this case, that was not what was happening, and it was actually a controlled experience. I didn't control your attention, but I actually controlled what happened to the patterns. So at some point, a pattern with the bass line moved, and now you can hear the bass line. So it is very possible that at this point you're like, okay, but it is a very powerful technique, and I suggest we go ahead and actually look at the track Particle Flow. So there you go. This is how it looks in my DAW. I already singled out the patterns we're going to be looking at. Right, so we're going to be looking at two patterns. The first pattern is the actual sequence. Right, so you hear it in the track at some point. And then the second pattern are the percussion and bass line. Okay, and if we zoom out, you'll actually see that I'm applying this technique to both of them. So I'm applying this shift to the percussion, And then while it's going, I'm applying this technique to the sequence. And so this changes, then while it's playing, the sequence changes, then percussion changes, and so on. Now let's listen to this. And it's going to be subtle. We're going to talk a little bit about how to apply this technique correctly, but for now, it's going to be subtle. Pay attention to the bass line. This is going to be the most easy thing to notice. So there you go. The change happened. See now, the bass line is slightly different, but very slightly. And now the change is going to happen to the sequence. So I'm actually going to pause it here because this is a very cool part. When the sequence changes here, I bet you were like, I don't hear a lot of change. But then by about this bit, you hear that the percussion changed because now they're playing differently relative to one another. And both because of the masking effect, some notes are now playing differently, and also because of the way your brain sort of parses the patterns, you now hear that the bass line has changed a little bit. You hear different kind of sounds emphasized, although not much has changed, right? So I'm moving it very, very slightly. It's actually moved by just a couple of steps. So let's listen to this again. There's going to be two changes in quick succession. I think this change is very, very cool because you can hear how the bass line changes, and now you can hear it clearer. And then with a lot of things happening, right? These are just two patterns here. Of course, in reality, the whole track is full of different things happening. There's this larger pad. There are additional sounds. There's this hi-hat. So here, suddenly the bass line changes. So although this technique is kind of very simple, you have to be careful with it, I think. And there are several tips that I can give you. So tip number one, do not apply it to kind of 4x4 kicks, claps, open hi-hats, anything that is like a skeleton to your percussion. In this case, in the case of particle flow, you can hear that the percussion is very frantic. There is no skeleton. The kicks, they don't really have this kind of regular 4x4 cadence. So in this case, it was very easy to move it around. But if I did have something like a 4x4 beat, or let's say that a beat that has this very particular rhythm that you can hear, you really don't want to shift that because it's going to feel weird, unless that's the effect you're going for. But normally you wouldn't want to do that, and so you'll have to separate into a separate pattern or however your DAW organizes it so that you move everything but these things. Typically, the things that work well is moving bass lines, actually. This is especially awesome in tracks that are kind of Berlin school tracks with a lot of sequences. The bass line can be moved around, and it's also very cool when the bass line has gaps, because then what happens is that you won't notice that a lot, but it will actually change it very much and make your track feel fresh and full of movement, and nobody will even understand like why. But the purpose here is not to kind of trick the listener into this. The purpose, of course, is to make the track interesting, but do it in a subtle way, because if the change is very abrupt, then it might be disorienting, and you want to introduce change kind of smoothly. Another bit, of course, is experiment with the amount of steps you're moving. It will depend on the kind of melody or pattern that you have going. In some cases, moving an odd amount is okay, like one step or 3 steps. In some cases, you'll have to move it only an even amount, like 2 steps or 4 steps. Sometimes the pattern is such that you want to move it like a bar only. But that's basically the idea, is that you're moving it just enough so that the pattern changes. Also, not every configuration will work, so experiment. In some cases, you'll move it by a step and it's awesome. Then you move it 2 steps and it doesn't sound interesting. Then you move it 4 steps and it's awesome again. So you find these bits and then you just copy them around and use them to your liking. It's also sometimes helping you to come up with interesting bass lines, because you came up with a bass line which is like okay, and then you move it a little bit and suddenly it adds, a little bit of a groove to it, and you end up using that bass line instead of your original one. So that's also an option, of course. And finally, uh, there is, I think, value in kind of making it subtle, but I did try to use it in a very obvious way in some house music. But the again, like separating the bass line and separating the claps and kick so that it's not jarring, but it's just okay. I hear it changed a lot. But this is where you'll have just use your judgment for this. Typically, I still reserve it for situations where I need to introduce kind of a subtle change. Anyway, guys, this is my technique. I hope you find it interesting and maybe even useful. So.